Hi everyone, I want to welcome you here. I'm Liz Lodge, I'm the director here at Penobscot Marine Museum, and I have the absolute pleasure of introducing Captain Charles Weeks tonight. I just learned tonight that he's a 1964 graduate of Maine Maritime Academy, and he has classmates here with him, so I think it's a reunion. And he is also the holder of an unlimited master's license from the United States Coast Guard for steam or motor vessels upon the ocean. He's a professor for many years at Maine Maritime Academy and is a professor emeritus there now, yes. Teaching a course on the Titanic, and he is an expert on the Titanic, researching and analyzing the Titanic for many years. And we are thrilled to have him here. It's a topic that so many of us are interested in and intrigued by, and it's my pleasure to introduce him to you tonight.
There are two Titanics. One is on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean out there that Dr. Ballard found and has been visited many times over, and lots of pictures. Matter of fact, back here is one of the books that Ballard did on discovering it. The other one is fictional. It's the ones they use in movies and various other stories. I will give Cameron credit. His setting was very accurate. They're very detailed on the model that they built for the movie. Because what wasn't accurate was Jack and Rose, and Rose's mother and her fiancé and that henchman he had with him. They're purely fiction. But other people, like Margaret Brown, understand she was never called Molly Brown in her lifetime. That came afterwards. Anyway, that is an example of a fictional Titanic. And tonight we're going to talk about the differences between these two ships. Another thing you need to know, when it comes to Titanic researchers, I hesitate to say aficionados or fans, but Titanic researchers, they seem to come in two varieties. One is the techies, or the rivet counters, myself included. We're more interested in the ship and what actually happened to her. The others are the humanists. They're more interested in all the human drama that went on that night, okay? And it'll thus color what you write or what you say about the subject. Couple of other things I want to clear up before I really get going. Tonnage. They talk about the Titanic, and she was roughly 46,000 gross registered tons. Registered tons are a volume. It's a measure of the size of the ship. They measure out the inside of the ship, calculate how many cubic feet, divide it by 100, and they'll come up with a gross registered tonnage. Then they deduct non-revenue earning spaces, and they get the net registered tonnage. But when you hear registered tonnage, whether it's gross or net, volume. On the other hand, displacement or dead weight are weight. That's Archimedes' principle. If you could pick the ship up and put it on a scale, this is what she'd weigh. You can't do that, so they use Archimedes' principle and measure out, well, they know the volume, and you divide it by 35, and it'll tell you how many tons it is. There's 35 cubic feet of salt water weighs 1 long ton. And in our industry, we use the long ton, 2240 pounds, or the metric ton, which is 2206 pounds, not the short ton, the 2,000 pound ton. Another thing, another point, there are two red herrings that come up in the Titanic, and they get mentioned in books and articles and such. One is binoculars, because the lookouts said we didn't have any binoculars up there in the crow's nest. What they had for binoculars in 1912 would not have done them any good. To have night glasses, the lenses have to be coated, and they've got to be at least 55 millimeters across on the front end to draw in enough light so you can see at night with them. What they had weren't going to see any better than the Mark I eyeball. Okay? The other red herring is the bunker fire. She was fueled with coal. coal is capable of spontaneously igniting. She had a fire in one of her coal bunkers, and they finally extinguished it on Saturday. She sank Sunday night, but they extinguished it Saturday, virtually by emptying the bunker and burning it in the boilers. Coal fires are very difficult to put out, but that was the best way. They used it. It didn't have any impact on the sinking. Okay? Fog of war comes up time after time. This was a phrase created by S.L.A. Marshall when he was writing history of the Second World War for the Army. He did a lot of interviews and came up with this ridiculously low figure of the number of troops who actually fired their rifle in anger at the enemy. But he also came up with this term, fog of war. If you're writing a history of it, you have to interview a lot of people because what any one soldier sees is what was in his foxhole or right in front of it. Well, on the Titanic, there's all kinds of people that had things to say about what happened that night. But their best chance at accuracy is what happened right there in front of them, not the whole picture. They couldn't see it all. The observer's viewpoint can color what they see. Example, if you remember Cameron's movie on Titanic, he tended to make the first-class passengers and the officers look kind of stupid, real stuck on themselves. That was his point of view. When the British made the movie A Night to Remember off Walter Lord's book, they portrayed the first-class passengers and the officers completely different. And so the observer's point of view will color what they're doing. Now, the less widely known facts. This is a copy of a painting by Ken Marshall of the Titanic as she would have appeared steaming westward. One of the things, when you're looking at pictures of the Titanic, if she's underway, it's valid to have smoke here, here, or here. No smoke there. That stack was a dummy. It ventilated engine spaces. The galleys ventilated through it, but not the ship's boilers. Only the forward three can do that. Reasoning behind all this, a little history. 1819, the Blackball Line established what was called packet service, using 10 ships maintain a weekly sailing between New York and Liverpool. The trip east was a lot quicker than the trip west, so it took 10 sailing ships to do it. It's what we today call liner service. You're on a fixed schedule from point A to point B, or maybe a couple others, but each port you either load or discharge passengers. And it'd be like the city bus line. 1900, White Star Line could maintain this service with 4 steamers. They had the big 4, and they were fast enough that 4 ships could now maintain weekly service. 1914, only 14 years later, White Star can do it with 3 ships. The intention was Olympic, the first sister, Titanic, and then Britannic, the third sister. Okay, Olympic actually was in the service up till 1936 when they scrapped it. Okay, Britannic was sunk in the First World War. She hit a mine up in the Aegean and sank. She was being used as a hospital ship. But Titanic, of course, we know, only partway through her maiden voyage hit the iceberg. By 1950, Cunard was maintaining this weekly service with 2 steamers. The Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, the originals. Queen Mary's out in Long Beach. The Queen Elizabeth is now buried under the airport in Hong Kong, having burned while under conversion. If you could. These are statistics from Titanic. Length overall, and length overall is the extreme length. This tells you how big a parking space she needs when you go into a port. 882. Her length between perpendiculars was 850. Her beam, the width of her, 92.5 feet. Draft full loaded, in round terms, 36 feet. Displacement at full load, 52,310. Now, I told you a few minutes ago that her gross tonnage was 46,000, but her maximum displacement was 52,310. So you see the difference between them. Total horsepower, 46,000. The two reciprocating engines each were 15,000, and the turbine was 16,000. So that's how you got the total. And she was designed for a service speed of 21, 22 knots. With that kind of speed, the three ships would have maintained the weekly service. Okay, hon. This is a transverse cutaway. It's one half of the ship. There's another half over here that we don't need to show because they're symmetrical port and starboard. The outer skin, the double bottom space, the inner bottom, these are boilers. Turn of the bilge keelson. The water line when she sailed was right about there. And then these are all the decks up to where the bridge is. The lifeboat sat here. So it gives you an idea of what she was like. Okay, Hannah, next one. This picture was taken in my office when I was still in active teaching. The two models are, the purpose is, there was a claim made that the Olympic class were to be 50% bigger than Cunard's Lusitania, Mauritania. These were rivals, and these things were fast. They'd do 25, 26 knots. Between Lusitania here and her sister Mauritania, they maintained the blue ribbon for fastest on the Atlantic for Cunard Line for over 25 years. And so White Star's competing with them. And they decided that the cost of coal, the amount of coal consumption to maintain that speed wasn't worth it, so they would go for grandeur. But they wanted the ships, they wanted some boasting rights, so make them 50% bigger. Well, you look at, these models are in the same scale, 1 to 350. And you can see that in no way is the Titanic 50% bigger. The catch is her gross tonnage. This one had a gross tonnage of 30,000 and she was 46. So she's roughly 50% bigger. But they're playing with that registered tonnage. Okay. Now, this is Titanic alongside Carnival Magic. See the difference? Titanic isn't so big there. The Magic's 1,004, based on Titanic's 882. 3,600 passengers, whereas the Titanic carried a lot less, about 2,600. Okay, let's have the next one. This is a more recent one. This is actually, because they're all artwork now, but Titanic in front of Allure of the Seas. The Allure of the Seas is 220,000 gross tons. She's 1,181 feet long, and her beam is 184 feet. So she's almost twice as wide as the Titanic. And as you can see, towers over her. This is the navigating bridge on the Allure of the Seas. Here it is on the Titanic. Okay, next one. This is a scale that I've made up. I do research all the time. Over here you have the draft, and crossed here you have displacements and the curve. Here's her light draft. You come in, hit the curve, go up here, and her light draft was 38,700. At full load, you go over here and you come up, and the 52,310. This was sailing Southampton at 51,240. By the night of the collision, she's over here at 44.3. And she's drawing 32 feet and 3 inches. They know that by calculation due to fuel consumption on her sister. They can compare and figure how much coal she would have burned getting to the collision. And the Howland and Wolff had these drawings, but they're not available to anybody. So we had to go back and we took plans of the ship and did calculations and came up with the volumes and whatnot to create this. So it was created from scratch. Okay. Titanic was registered in the UK, owned in the United States. J.P. Morgan owned the International Mercantile Marine, which owned the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, which owned the White Star Line. But she was registered in the UK. Her keel was laid in March of '09. She was launched in May of '11. Her fitting out, that is, once you launch her, then you put all the stuff inside, like the boilers and the engines, and build the cabins and put the stacks on and all that, was twice delayed due to Olympic's need to return to the shipyard for repairs. The first time was when the Olympic had a collision with the Royal Navy cruiser Hawk down in the Solent. That was the first indication of hydrodynamics. When two ships get close together and they're running, they get sucked together. The second time, Olympic hit something in mid-ocean and lost one blade off her propeller and had to limp back and get that fixed. April 2nd, she went through her builder's trials and then sailed for Southampton. Olympic had 2 days of builder's trials, which is piddling by today's standards. Titanic had 8 hours. As long as she met certain criteria, they said, okay, her sister was good, she did this, she's good too. That's all they did. And they adjusted the compass that day. On April 4th, shortly after midnight, she arrived in Southampton, tied up. April 10th at noon, she sailed. She had a close brush with the liner New York. Again, hydrodynamics. She came out of her berth, came around, and the suction brought the liner New York away from the pier. They almost collided. Fortunately, a couple of the tugs got in the way and pushed the New York back, but it delayed the Titanic 1 hour, not for what she made that up. But a lot of people say, oh, this is a bad omen. April 11th, she arrived in Queenstown, sailed at 1:30 for New York. She proceeded coastwise down the Irish coast to Fastnet, from Queenstown to Fastnet, which is Lighthouse on an island on the southwest corner of Ireland. And at that point, she then went Great Circle to the corner. The corner is down here, 42 north, 47 west. These track lines were established by all the shipping companies on the North Atlantic jointly got together and set up track lines for different times of the year where you're going eastbound or westbound, trying to keep them from hitting head to head. And they would bring it down here to try and stay away from the ice. Well, of course, the Titanic didn't manage that, but most people managed to stay away from the ice by following this route. They'd go run line, New York to here, Great Circle, or in our case, Great Circle to here, and then run line in. And she, at 5:50 that Sunday afternoon, she turned the corner and started the run line back, got that far. The red boxes represent regular full-size plotting sheets that I have it plotted out. And if you put those up, it's 24 feet long to show the route. She was on the southern route westbound, turned the corner at 5:50, as I said. Her new course was 266 true. At 19:30 or 7:30 that night, Second Officer Lightoller shot around to stars to get the Titanic's position. The way they did it, using the model, Lightoller would have been out here in the bridge wing shooting the stars with his sextant. He'd say, mark, somebody inside here'd note the chronometer, what the time was. He'd hand them the sextant in through the door. They'd read it, the altitude that he measured, and from that they could calculate the star. At night, the senior officer of the watch stayed out on the forebridge so he didn't ruin his night vision. If you went inside, he was going to see some light and it would ruin his night vision. And while they had 2 lookouts up here in the crow's nest, they were relying heavily on that senior watch officer out there. So anyway, he shot 6 stars. Now, the 4th officer, Boxhall, was basically considered the navigator. So he got to work these things out. And in testimony, it was very interesting because he's the one who gave the position for the distress call. He couldn't remember where the star site worked out to, which I found was rather interesting. That he got in, both in the United States and in England in the inquiries, and he couldn't remember the results he got. But you can figure it out because you look at what he gave, and he told the court how he got it. He started with the star site, walked along the course line they were going at the speed he understood they were making, and that's how he got the CQD. So you take the elapsed time at that speed, walk it back along, and you come up where the star site must have been. But he talked if they shot 3 stars for latitude and 3 for longitude. That's not the way it's done. You want the stars all around, so you get a pinwheel or a wagon wheel. If you do 3 for latitude, you're going to get 3 lines going that way. If you do 3 for longitude, you're going to get 3 lines going that way. And really all you've got is, you might just as well have 2 stars. So this comes up again in the testimony. People had funny ideas of what they actually did that night. At 11:40, she hit the iceberg, commenced flooding. 2:20, the next morning, she sank. Interesting point, 2 hours and 40 minutes for her to sink. In 1916, her younger sister, Britannic, is a hospital ship, whose hull had been improved. They learned lessons from Titanic. They extended the double bottoms further up the side and things like that to make her even less sinkable than Titanic was supposed to be. She hit that mine up there in Mundros Channel, just northeast of Athens, and she went down in 50 minutes. So the improved version did worse than the original. Okay. At about 10 minutes past 4 that morning, the Carpathia arrives and picks up 712 survivors. Okay. April 18th was a Thursday. Carpathia arrives in New York and berths at Pier 54 in what are called the Chelsea Piers. They're just west of Greenwich Village. They're not up in the 80s and 90s up west of Times Square where cruise ships go today. They were down just west of Greenwich Village. And they actually had to extend the piers to handle the Olympic class because they were so big. But anyway, she arrived there. Place was packed with people, 12th Avenue and all that. Just plain rubberneckers and people coming hoping that their relative would come down the gangway. April 19th through May 4th, the U.S. Senate inquiry run by William Alden Smith, the senator from Michigan. One of the things that doesn't come out too quickly, William Alden Smith hated J.P. Morgan with a passion. He knew that Morgan owned IMM, and he was going to get him. Matter of fact, Morgan was originally booked to ride west on the Titanic. He'd been in Europe, but something came up and he didn't make the trip. Fortunate for him. May 2nd through July 8th, the British held an inquiry. Their system is different than ours. The British Board of Trade, which would be like our Coast Guard as far as shipping regulations, had asked the Attorney General to appoint a wreck commissioner, and he appointed Lord Mersey of Hoxteth. He was a retired jurist. He'd been on the King's Bench. Most recently, he'd been in charge of the Admiralty and Divorce Courts. And then he retired, but they brought him back as wreck commissioner. And so he had 5 assessors, people with nautical backgrounds. He had a rear admiral, he had a guy from an elder brethren of Trinity House, which oversaw their navigation buoys and lighthouses. He had a professor in naval architecture. He had a Navy Reserve commander. But these were people that could tell him the finer points of going to sea. not but what he had dealt with a lot of marine cases over the years. Anyway, he is put in charge and oversees this. On April 17th through June 11th, they went out and recovered bodies at sea. The Mackay Bennett and the Mima, two cable ships that were chartered to go out. The people that are buried in Halifax or any place else they may have wound up buried ashore, it's because of those two ships. They recovered 337 bodies that they brought back. They recovered more, but crew or third class, they tended to sew them up in a bag and over the side they went. Others were brought home. Most of them are in Halifax, in the 3 cemeteries up there. Okay. Now, this picture is mislabeled. These are not the Titanic offices. Some of them are. This picture is actually the deck of the offices for the maiden voyage of the Olympic. This is indeed E.J. Smith. And this is Murdoch. He's the guy, the senior watch officer when the accident occurred. This is Hugh McElroy, the chief purser. But the rest of these people were not. They say this is Weil. It's not. His name is Evans, and he was on the Olympic. The weather, little fog between Belfast and Southampton. And from Southampton to New York, clear, good visibility. Temperature was cool. It got colder Sunday evening because they were on the Grand Banks, and under the seawater temperature went down because of the Labrador current. That Sunday evening, there was no moon. It was pitch black out there. You might just as well go down in a coal mine. It was so clear and still, they said you could see stars rising and setting. And that's really something. The berg was spotted, and we've gone back knowing the maneuvering characteristics of Titanic, some of which were recorded, but a lot of it came from her sister Olympic. They spotted the berg a quarter of a mile ahead. It gave them about 40 seconds to avoid the collision. As you know, they couldn't. I have done simulation work with the bridge simulator over at the Academy in my class. When I do get together with the students, I make each one of them try Murdoch's maneuver and see if they can get by. And at a quarter of a mile, you're going to hit it. At a third of a mile, if you're a good ship handler, know what you're doing, you can miss the berg. Okay? Anyway, these very serious-looking characters were the deck crew and purser for the Olympic. Okay. There's the crow's nest with its bell. There were 2 men in there. They'd climb up inside. There was a ladder, come out this door. There was a bell up there, and there was a telephone on the after side over here. Now, this picture is actually a model. I have not been down to the Titanic, and it wouldn't look that good anyway at this point. But this was a model that was down in Mystic at the aquarium, and I took this picture of it. They were about 35 feet higher than the bridge. That would extend their horizon, but in that night they'd have been better off to be out on the forecastle head. They'd have seen more. Okay. This picture was taken the next morning from the Carpathia. This is one of the icebergs that was out there. It's not generally attributed the one that, who knows which one hit it. There was a person took a picture of one that fit the description. One guy who saw the berg said it looked like the Rock of Gibraltar in shape. Somebody saw one of those and he took a picture of it because he was fascinated by the red mark on the side of it, probably from the bottom paint. But anyway, people on the Carpathia got up and used cameras, and they took this picture of that berg and the next picture. That's the ice pack that was out there that was such a block that kept, for instance, the Californian went west through it, then south down the west side of it, and then east back through it to get to where the Carpathia was picking up the lifeboats. The Mount Temple from the Canadian Pacific, stopped on the west side of it because he calculated I'm at the position they gave for the SOS or CQD. And besides, Canadian Pacific had a rule that you're not to go through ice with our ships. And so the captain stopped. Okay? But that's part of it. These pictures are in the National Archives in New York. They were submitted as part of the information having to do with the limitation of liability hearings. You can go in New York to the National Archives and you can see these pictures. And they'll let you Xerox them or, I scanned it. That's how I got it that way. Next shot. This is a picture of that same ship model, but this is a side view of the bridge. And they had these little dog houses out there. And when Boxhall talks about morsing the ship that they could see, this and this, they're on the top of the cabs are the Morse lights. They are not very high wattage. The gimmick is they have a Fresnel lens, which intensifies the beam. But still, I can tell you from experience, a light like that is not going to be seen that far. Today, we use 16-inch projectors with shutters that open and close, and you can see them 12 and 16 miles away. But you wouldn't have seen those that far away. Okay? The bridge is, this is number one. No, this is actually boat A. No, boat C. Number one is outboard. This goes into the wheelhouse. This is the forebridge. They had a wheel in the forebridge. They only used it when coming and going out of port. At sea, they used the one in there. If you could. This is looking down on that model, and I've put the little figurines where people claim they were, those who got to talk afterwards, at the time of the collision. Murdoch was in here because he'd rung a telegraph to stop the engines. Captain came out of his cabin out through here. This is Fourth Officer Boxhall. It's intriguing. In his testimony, he said he was off of the bridge. He was back down the starboard side of the deck house. He'd just come out of his quarters. He was on watch. He should not have been. We have to assume he was sent off the bridge on ship's business, although he never specifies it. And he was walking up the side. He just stepped out of the quarters, and he heard the three rings. And so he turned and headed for the bridge, walked up along the side here. The iceberg passed him. He never saw it. Intriguing. He must have been night blind. He never saw it. But Oliver, standby quartermaster, was coming in this way. He looked across and saw it go by. The top of the berg was higher than the bridge wing, so it was more than 70 feet above the water. Now, you can take that height of 70 feet and assume a equilateral or isosceles triangle and calculate volumes, and knowing that only 1/8 of it's above water, you know how much of it was below water. Anyway, this is Hitchings on the wheel, and Moody, the sixth officer, was supervising him. Of this crew, Boxhall survives, Hitchings survives, Oliver survives. The rest of them were lost. The two lookouts survived. So the only people, and there was a quartermaster back on the stern named Rowe, the only people that ever saw the berg were the two lookouts in the crow's nest. He never did. He did, and the guy on the stern. So 4 people saw the berg. And that was when it was right alongside. Or in Rowe's case, as it came by. At first he thought it was a full-rigged ship going by, and then he caught on to the fact it was an iceberg. When this guy talks about, he was about abreast of the captain's cabin when she hit, and it hit on the bluff of the bow. He's telling you what someone else told him because he never saw the berg. So he couldn't have known what happened. Next. All right, this is an Arco tanker, and it itself has nothing to do with the Titanic, but it illustrates how ships turn. because we talk about Murdoch's maneuver. Fleet spotted the berg, strikes the bell 3 times, something right ahead, phones the bridge, Moody answers it, and Fleet says, iceberg dead ahead. Moody repeats the message to First Officer Murdoch. He yells it out to him out on the bridge. Murdoch orders hard to starboard, which means to turn left, and they claim he ordered full astern. Everything I can find says, yes, he rang stop. He did not ring full astern. Even if he had, she'd have been by the berg before the engineers would have got the thing going astern. These ships don't do things on a dime. I talked to the engineers on the John Brown down in Baltimore, one of the 2 remaining Liberty ships, and they've got these reciprocating engines, or what we call knee action turbines, and like the Titanic's wing propellers. And they estimated it was going to take about 2.5 minutes for them to get that thing reversed and going astern from full sea speed. So, anyway, Murdoch's idea was, if this is the berg, I'm going to go around it like this. The term he used was to port around. So, back here, had a starboard. Okay, they're using tiller orders, like you would in a small sailboat with a tiller. You put the tiller to starboard, the rudder goes to port, the ship goes to port. Today, we would say hard left or hard right. Turn the top of the wheel to the left, the rudder goes to the left, the ship goes to the left, achieving what they called hard to starboard. Okay? Because on conventionally powered ships like Titanic, where propellers and rudder are all back here, when you do this, the stern swings in the opposite direction, thus forcing the bow to turn. And so, you see how she's side-slipping around? Now, had she been in a left-hand turn like this ship is, when she hit the berg, what's going to happen? That berg's going to bump and bang the whole length of her. She'd have been opened up from stem to stern and would have gone down quite quickly. She didn't. There's no report of damage any further back than number 5 boiler room, and that's a small hole in one of the coal bunkers. The fact that that was the case says she couldn't have been in a left-hand turn. She was either straightened out at that point or was turning to the right, so her stern swung clear of the iceberg. Okay, next. This is much like what I've drawn there. And go to the next one. And the next one. See, there's no damage back there on the ship. I mean, there is now because of what happened in the breakup and sinking, but there was no flooding occurring back in that area. Ergo, it could not have hit the berg. Okay, next one. Now, damage to the ship. The model I have, when you saw a picture of it a minute ago. When you read Walter Lord's A Night to Remember, the way he describes it, based on, see, when he got ready to write that book, he put ads in all kinds of magazines in Great Britain and newspapers and such, asking for anybody that was there to write him, tell him what they knew about it. Based on that, he talked of the 300-foot gash. Okay? Somebody else was talking, oh, it dragged along on the bottom. It would have looked like that. When they sent Matheson out there with his side scan sonar that he put down there, and it looked down through the mud, and they traced it along, these are the gaps that they found. It's over a 300-foot length, but it's not continuous 300 feet. When you look at the rate of flooding, and we'll show it in a minute, if you go back and calculate in 40 minutes how much volume of water came in, you use, I'll remember the term when I don't want to, it talks about flow through an orifice, and you can calculate how big the orifice had to be to get this amount of water in this amount of time. Okay? And the answer you come up with is about 12 square feet, which is roughly the size of a normal household door. But it's broken up over gaps. Okay? Had it been 300 feet long, it would have been 3/4 of an inch wide. Now, the other thing to remember is ice isn't strong enough to rip open the steel like this. The steel on that ship was good. I know there's some contests about it, but it was good. After all, Olympic, her sister, lasted till 1936 with the same steel, including hitting the cruiser Hawk, hitting a tugboat in New York, ramming a U-boat in the First World War, and then running down the Nantucket Lightship in 1934. Okay? So there's nothing wrong with that steel. It may not be up to our grade today, but it was standard grade then. It's the rivets that had slag in them, the wrought iron rivets that we used up here in the bow and then back in the stern, because they could hand set them. Whereas midships, they used that big pincher thing, and they used wrought iron rivets. Now, riveted joints, which were the state of the art then, because they didn't have welding. You get a double seamed rivet, it's got plates on each side, or you can have what's called a strap rivet. This one strap goes over the seam, or you can have a lap rivet, which just overlaps one. The thing with riveting, you have to have two parallel pieces of metal that you can rivet through to hold them together. You can't make a T-fitting with a rivet. The way riveted joints fail, they crack along the line, they rip out, they can pull apart this way, that's possible for the Titanic, or they can shear off that way, and that is also possible. But inevitably, what you're going to find is the rivets were what let go and opened it up. Okay. Next one. This is based on testimony. I colored in a inboard profile showing where the flooding was. So the green stuff was 10 minutes after. There's reports of those spaces flooded that much. 20 minutes is the blue. It had gotten a bit more there. This is number 1 hold, number 2 hold, number 3 hold, boiler room 6, boiler room 5, and so on through. Eventually it's all under, but eventually Lightoller was up on the top of the house. He'd been putting one of the collapsible lifeboats off, and then he walked over to the edge and just dove into it because the water was coming up. At that point, he said the water line was at the crow's nest and the bridge. That's about a 15-degree down angle. Very quickly thereafter is when she broke, and the bow went down much deeper, but the keel was still attached. It pulled the stern up a bit. It broke, the stern flopped back, and then the stern started flooding, and it went into almost vertical before it sank. But nobody in the lifeboats testified to any kind of wave. Now, it was absolutely flat calm there that night. You would expect, if this ship was going up and down very much, that it would have created a little tidal wave out there, but there's no report of such. So it was all very gentle. Okay. This is young Jack Thayer, 16-year-old. He survived. His father died, but he and his mother survived. And while he was on the Carpathia, he was talking to an artist who put this rendition together, which is true in that Thayer said she broke in half. Lightoller and a few others, I think there was 4 out of 32 that claimed they saw her sink. 4 of them said she went down intact. The remaining 28 all said she broke in half. And he did, but Lord Mercy chose to listen to the second and third officers, what they had to say. The difference was Lightoller was in front of the ship where he dove off the top of the bridge. He's looking end on at this thing. Thayer was alongside number 2 stack, so he was looking at the side. But who's going to believe a 16-year-old? Okay. Next one. This is a plan of the boat deck we hear all this talk about gates that held the third class back. Well, these are gates up on the boat deck. They separate the officers' promenade from first class, from officers from second class back here. Okay, people up there could see subsequently a ship's lights. They estimated 5 miles away. It's a real argument now. If you want to start a brawl at a Titanic convention, say that wasn't the California or that was the California. And I guarantee you, be like the waters parting in the Bible as they go to the sides of the room, depending on how they feel about it. These people that were up here could see these lights. Strangely enough, the lookouts testified at the time the accident and she stopped, there wasn't a thing in sight in the way of lights. Okay, next one. This is a view of the boat deck. These are those gates I had circled. They're about that high. You're pretty feeble if that's going to stop you from getting to a lifeboat and saving your life. Okay, next one, hon. This is looking forward. Here's the set of gates, first class officers. And this is boat 2 is out here, 4, 6, 8. These are 2 of the collapsibles. There's 2 other 2 on the other side. This is the dome and such over the grand staircase that came crashing in Cameron's movie. Okay. This is the boat deck and midship. This is the standard magnetic compass. It's 230 feet after the bridge, but it's up here. They thought it would, the ship's the magnetic force of the compass would be less affected by the ship up there. The deviation would be minimized by putting it up there instead of putting it on top of the wheelhouse. I might also point out, because there were compass there and a compass there, that the wheelhouse, this part of the bridge, the center part, was made of wood. These were metal. But this center part was made out of wood and had bronze fittings so as to minimize the effect on the compass. Okay. This is B deck. This is the 2 decks below. This is the forecastle head. This, Jack and Rose up here, doing this bit. And these are the parlor suites. Jack and Rose had one of these. In truth was, Ismay had one, and Mrs. Benjamin Cardoza from Philadelphia had the other one. She's the lady with the 25 trunks that filed the claim for about $1.5 million for her lost possessions. Then you got the well deck here. Now, there are gates, the ladders that come up from the well deck to this deck. And I'll show you a picture here in a second of them. They had gates on them, but again, they should not have impeded anybody over the age of 4. This is the fantail. Okay, hon. Yeah, this is what the gates look like. Come up the ladder. You reach over it, unlatch it, open it. Next one. This is the one from the foredeck up. This is where third-class passenger Buckley climbed up. He got to the top, and one of the stewards was saying, no, you can't come through. And Buckley says, in a huss's you know what, clubbed him one and kept on going. Poor Buckley. He got to the United States. Subsequently, he joined the U.S. Army and was killed in France in the First World War. Okay, hon. This is E deck. And that's where the Master-at-Arms cabin was that supposedly Jack was in, although they didn't portray it that way. This is Scotland Road, the main fore and aft passageway on E deck. The green are third-class spaces, the yellow are crew. This is first class. These are second or first, as need be. This is an engine casing. These are the first 3 funnels. The 4th one's up over here. You have ports they could open, but here's one of the Bostwick gates. Here's the other one. Those are the only 2 we can find proof of below decks. So this business of either in A Night to Remember or in Cameron's, where they're trying to bust their way through or somehow get through these expanding metal gates, is not accurate. What happened was these doors, that go into like the main staircase or other such escape doors were not marked or said crew only. And the third-class passengers knew their place in this world, so they wouldn't open the door. Finally, one of the stewards grabbed a bunch of them, took them in, and got them up the main staircase, but it was very late on. Carpathia to the rescue. Go ahead. Carpathia is down here, and Titanic CQ position is there. You measure it on the chart, 58 nautical miles, roughly northwest. Now, because of that, and how soon Carpathia got there, about 4:10 in the morning, somebody did the math and said, oh, she was doing 17 and a half knots. Carpathia was a 14-knot ship. There are definite limits to how much faster you can make a 14-knot ship go, and 17 is beyond the realm of possibility. You just can't produce enough steam to make her engines go fast enough to do that. Because the reason of it all was that Carpathia starts from here. This is the CQD position. The Titanic actually was here, and the current set the lifeboats down here, so the Carpathia coming up found them there. She did not go 58 miles, therefore she did not make 17 and a half knots. But it made good press, and it worked very well for Captain Rostron. He got a medal out of it. He was later promoted to Commodore of the Cunard line, and he got his trying to think of the term, his OBE, Order of the British Empire, and retired in the 30s and died in the 40s. But, you know, made good drama and such. This was the Carpathia's route. She was going into the Med. This is the Californian's route, and she's going to Boston. And she was north of the Titanic. Was she 20 miles away or was she 5 miles away? We could stand here till dawn arguing it and we still wouldn't have the answer. They heard the SOS. The radio operator took the information to Captain Rostron. They woke him up out of a sound sleep. And he kind of woke up like a wounded bear until he caught on to it was a serious thing. And then he was just like an electric spark. He had orders for everybody. The whole ship was organized. They arrived on the scene. They brought people aboard the safest way possible. Most of the lifeboats got hauled aboard. Some of them were hauled up on the davits for Carpathia's lifeboats. Others were picked up with the cargo gear and set on deck. The stewards were all together with coffee and sandwiches and whatnot. They weren't sure what they were going to find. About 3 o'clock in the morning, he saw a green light ahead. He thought it might still be the side light of the Titanic. She might be afloat. What it was Boxhall in lifeboat number 2 playing Statue of Liberty with a green flare that he saw. And of course, they'd see it and then lose it because there were icebergs in the way. So along with this high-speed run, they're dodging icebergs. When he arrived, the lifeboats were where he thought he was at the CQD position. He wasn't. Carpathia wasn't as fast as thought, however. Rostron was a hero. He picked up the only survivors there were, 712 of them, and he had a few that died on board within the next day or so, still suffering from hypothermia. His organizational skills were fantastic. He headed back to New York. You saw the chart. Let's have the next one. This is interesting. Talk about mismanagement. The early boats that were launched were like half full. Had they filled them up, they had room for that many people instead of that. Now, part of it was Lightoller, who claimed he was afraid that if he put the full capacity, 65 people in the boat, the thing would buckle in the middle and dump them all in the water. It's a valid concern, except the ship is brand new, the falls are brand new. She just had a test in Southampton where they put that amount of weight in the boats and proved that they could handle it. Part of it was also the passengers. if you're on a ship and she starts to roll over, you're going to know it real fast. There's no denying what's happening because it's a short dimension. But if they're going down by the bow, unless she's pitching in a big seaway like this, she's going down slowly by the bow, it's not so noticeable. Beasley talked about walking up a ladder and suddenly noticing that his feet were hitting the treads wrong because of a bit of a trim by the head. But he's about the only one who noticed it. Well, here's this nice, big, well-lit, warm ship, and you want me to get in that dingy little thing out here in the middle of the ocean? Get real. And so they wouldn't get in it. Then there was the bit of the wife wouldn't go without the husband type thing. And so that all added up to. But in reality, they could have taken every woman and child on there and still taken another 645 men. But they didn't. Next one. These are pictures from that next morning, taken from the Carpathia. This is Fifth Officer Lowe with Lifeboat 14. He actually rigged the sail and sailed the thing, and he picked up this collapsible, D I think it is, and towed it close to the Carpathia. And this picture was taken of them coming alongside. Next one. This is looking down at collapsible D. Now, when they say collapsible, the bottom was hard wood, just like any boat would be. The sides would collapse down. There were metal rods in them folded like this, and you'd grab the gunnel and pull it up, and the rod would straighten up and hold this canvas up to make a hull. Not something I want to make an epic voyage in, but they did, as you can see, it worked. But you also see how few crew members are people that could row in there. These ladies from first class, God, they hardly squeezed their own orange juice in the morning, let alone manual labor like this. But they managed, you know. Margaret Brown was right in there pulling an oar with the best of them. She threatened to throw the coxswain of her boat overboard. It was hitchings. And hitchings started coming apart in the boat. In testimony, you'll hear about it. And he was of the definite opinion that they were going to blame him because he was on the wheel. They're going to say I went the wrong way or something. He claimed he didn't, and there's no reason to expect he did. But he really started coming apart, and he was raising hell with everybody. And Margaret, or Molly, as she came to be known, threatened to come back there and throw him overboard if he didn't settle down and get about business. Anyway, Ismay is in that boat, managing director of the White Star Line. Carpathia arrived in New York Thursday evening, April 18th. It was a stormy night. The pier and surrounding streets were full of people, the curiosity and looking for survivors, relatives. Also present was Senator Alden Smith from Michigan, and he had a federal marshal with him, and they started summoning people to appear in the hearings. And the first guy he summoned was Ismay. But then he went to Lightoller, senior surviving officer, and all the officers, and on he went. Those inquiries, first in the United States and then in the UK, were followed by the limitation of liability hearings in New York. The White Star Line petitioned to limit their liability for damages to the amount of the unpaid freight and the value of the ship after the accident. The value was the value of 13 lifeboats that the Carpathia had brought in. And I have at home copies of reports from a boatyard in New York that came up and inventoried those boats and valued them in their contents. And it amounted to, you know, a dime on the dollar, the money that was there to settle the claims. Subsequently, a Mr. Ryan sued the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, the parent of White Star Line, for the death of his son. His son was a steward on board, and he died in the sinking, and Mr. Ryan sued the company, and he won. But also, amazingly enough, the company managed to limit their liability. The court sided with them and said that they could limit their liability. So that's what made such a small pool that could be used for settling these claims. Life aboard the Titanic. Dr. Ballard's discovery of the wreck spurred Cameron's movie Titanic. Now, interestingly enough, Cameron could be very honest about the whole thing. In one of his video television presentations, he said, when it comes to making a movie and you go to the finance people to get the money to do it, the Titanic was the easiest sell he ever had. He walked into the meeting and said, look guys, I got an idea for this movie. Romeo and Juliet on the Titanic. Hey, that's great. They did it. That's the thesis of that film. There has been a lot of talk about building a second Titanic. There was big, all sorts of big dinner parties this winter bringing out the idea. I've seen pictures of it. I'll tell you, any connection between Titanic 2 and Titanic 1 is going to be purely coincidental. So far, nobody has, well, now this fellow from Australia has come up with the money. They estimated about $400 million to build a new Titanic. Even if they did it, it'd be a poor investment. There are a limited number of people who have the money or the interest for such a trip. He'll probably get a fair turnout for his first trip, but the things I'm hearing is to be up there in first class, you better be as rich as Astor was. Third class, you could probably afford, more in line with a cruise ship cost. For all the talk, people today would be bored silly on the Titanic. There's no casino. The closest they had was the gentleman's smoking room. There were card games going on up there, but nothing like what you see on a cruise ship today. No climbing walls. No ice skating rinks. What facilities she had a pool inside, well down below decks, heated saltwater pool. It was segregated. Certain sexes could go, you know, men at this hour, women at this hour. Only first class. You had to pay to go there. They had the Turkish bath, which would correspond to the spa they have today, but it wasn't completely the same. They had a squash court, if that was your cup of tea. And they were all for first class only. Very few of the cabins were en suite. Most of them had a wash basin, but you went down the passageway for the head or the shower or the tub. And third class had 2 bathtubs for the whole of third class. And they were way back in the stern over the propeller, so it must have been, watch the waves. The only place you could dance was in the reception room outside the first class dining room. Further, various government agencies would require the new ship to, 1, have lifeboat space for all, no coal fuel, that's too smoky. I know of one coal burner around, that's the Energy Independence, and she's owned by a coal company. She runs from Norfolk up to Bryant Point in Rhode Island. And because they're carrying their own coal, they grind it up and atomize it, and they manage to keep the smoke within limits. But you take California, you come in there, even on a diesel ship, they want you to shut down and go on shore power so that your diesels aren't polluting the air. She would have to have a lot of electronic equipment on the bridge, radar, GPS, GMDSS, gyro compass. Watertight bulkheads would have to come up to the main deck or sea deck level. Fireproof construction, no more wood paneling, and no more of those carpets either. And you'd also have to put air conditioning in. In short, the Titanic was designed to resemble one of these country estates like Downton Abbey. Okay? Downton Abbey, the first year or so of Downton Abbey was Titanic vintage. They wanted the passengers to forget where they were. She was really a means of getting from one side to the other. How did the accident occur? She received numerous radio messages of ice. The night was dark, so they couldn't see the berg. They thought they'd see it a half to a mile away. That was their best take on it. They couldn't see it in time to avoid it. The surviving officers and other ship captains appearing as witnesses all testified that Titanic was doing what everybody did on the North Atlantic. You went full speed ahead until you actually, in clear visibility, which she was, until you saw the ice, Then you either slowed down or altered course. It didn't work for her. After that, nobody did it, supposedly. These are some other ship disasters. Okay, Titanic, 1,500 people, roughly. The General Slocum was a steamer in New York Harbor. Had a Lutheran church group on board, went for a picnic, caught fire in the East River. Empress of Ireland, right up here in the St. Lawrence River, Rimousk, Quebec. She's right off there, farther point. And she was 2 years later, 1914. You don't hear much about her because about 3 months after her, we had First World War. Also, she didn't have any millionaires on board. She was carrying mostly Salvation Army people going from Canada to England for a convention. Just wasn't newsworthy. It was a result of cross signals. One guy went left, the other went right. Bang. Sultana, steamboat on the Mississippi River, the end of the Civil War, bringing repatriated Union prisoners from Andersonville Prison north. She caught fire at night and sank. We don't have a clue how many people were lost on that because they were getting so much ahead for putting them aboard, and they just kept putting them aboard as long as there was deck space to stand on. They have found her wreck. In more recent years, the Mississippi has changed her course, and now she's sitting in the middle of a cornfield, what's left of her. Wilhelm Gutslav. She was a German strength through joy ship for the Nazis. At the end, during the war, she didn't do anything, but at the end of the war, they sent her to East Prussia to pick up Germans and bring them west to keep them away from the Communist Army. And a Russian submarine got her and got the General Steuben within miles of each other off the North Polish coast in February of 1945. But this is somewhat of a guess. Again, everybody that could get aboard did, so it was a very high. There was a bunch of German lady Marines down in the swimming pool, down inside. Very few of them survived. I did have a student once whose mother was a survivor of the Gutslav. Lusitania in 1100. Donna Paz is an inter-island ferry in the Philippines, 3,000. Again, nobody really paid a lot of attention to how many people they put aboard. With that, some parting thoughts. No ship is unsinkable. Now, Howland and Wolff never said she was. They said practically unsinkable. The press took the practically out and made her unsinkable. Safe navigation requires constant attention to the details. Never assume anything. Train your crew well in all matters, how to navigate, how to keep a lookout, how to handle the lifeboats. Part of Titanic's problem was the stewards and the engineers weren't trained to handle lifeboats. There was a few that knew how, but today, all the deck, engine, and stewards department are trained and have to be certified as a lifeboatman. In her day, they didn't. Only the deck department did. Titanic's story is well covered. I know of 75 books, 4 movies, and numerous websites devoted to her. So it seems like everybody that could pick up a pen has written about it. As Walter Lord said in A Night to Remember, it's a rash man indeed who would set himself up as the final arbitrator of what happened that incredible night the Titanic went down. The survivors at best could only report what they saw or thought they saw. None of them saw it all. Further, the press, from the Sunday night until Thursday night when they get in, the press is operating in a vacuum. The press doesn't work well in a vacuum. Bits and pieces coming in over the radio and trying to cobble it together to make the story, cover it in the papers. You get some of these strange, she's in tow. One of the liners towing her to Halifax, or they've taken all the passengers off and they're going to deliver them. White Star Line actually chartered a train from the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railway and had it underway going to Halifax before they got the word that indeed she'd sunk and nobody was coming to Halifax. They stopped it in Portland, Maine, turned it back around. But Captain Rostron was very careful about who he let, what messages were sent by radio and what they said. And that's what left the press guessing as to what had occurred. I would also like to point out there is a drawing. You see the horizon there, and an iceberg like that, and the bow of the Titanic. And this drawing was done by Fleet, the man who first saw it. When he was testifying, he made a drawing that looked like this. He said this was 1 point off, which is 11¼ degrees. Now, if you assume that it's a mile away, when it gets a beam, it's going to be 1,100 feet off. She couldn't have hit it at 1,100 feet off. So Mr. Fleet had an erroneous idea of what he saw. Okay? That is the substance of what I have to say about the Titanic. Anybody got any questions?
I'm curious how the captain of the ship that arrived that day, the Carpathia and the California, what made them so organized that they were able to care for an additional almost 800 people?
The Californian had a large capacity because usually westbound she carried a lot of immigrants. Her run was to Fiume, today's Rijeka, and up in the Adriatic. And so she was picking up a lot of immigrants from Southeast Europe and bringing them west. But eastbound, she had a very small number of passengers on board. So she had lots of room that she could put them in. But they still wound up sleeping on the deck in the lounge and places like that. Even the captain gave up his cabin, I think, to 2 women. And all the officers did. It's just that Captain Rostron was one of these people that is organized to the nth degree. And so, you know, he started spouting orders as fast as he hit the bridge. Told him, get all the department heads up here. Okay, steward, I want coffee ready. I want sandwiches ready. Blankets ready. The English doctors to deal with first class. The Hungarian doctors to deal with third class. They carried both because they were in the immigrant trade. And he had the deck crew up there. They didn't put all the lights out because they needed dark to see. But once they came on site, they had lights hanging over the side. They had gantlins rigged. They put coal bags on the end of the gantlins, and if there was a small child in there, they'd plunk them in the coal bag and hoist them up. And I think a lot of the women got brought aboard the same way. He was just a very organized person. Yeah?
It took quite a while to find the wreck of the Titanic.
Yeah.
And there are some ideas out there being kicked around why that's so. But how far was it away from where they thought it was? When they
13.1 miles west by north. Or she's east by south, 13.1 miles from the CQD position. There were 2 CQDs sent out. The first one was by the captain, but Boxhall corrected it, and that was the one they talk about. And it's 13.1 miles east by south from that is where the wreckage is. Now, there's some question about the British Navy may have found her earlier when they were doing mappings of those areas. They wanted the contour maps, you know, Red October, that type thing. Okay. There's possibility that they had found her but decided not to say anything. Jack Grimm, when he went, probably came within 5 miles of her, but then stopped. And the French got within about 2 miles of her at the time that Ballard finally found her. Yes?
Can you tell me, sorry, what CQD is? I don't know what that is.
CQD, it was the distress call that they used. It's a code. You can't translate it to anything.
Okay.
Anyone you can translate SOS to anything. When you see these written out, it's with a bar over the top of it. Means that when Sparky's transmitting it, he just goes dit 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 da 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 dit dit dit. He doesn't make it 3 letters, and it's so distinctive that people will hear it. When you're communicating with Morse code, you can either spell a word out to make a message, or you can look through the code book and find a code group, and SOS is the code group for distress. Yes?
Did the disaster have any impact on the transatlantic business in the years following?
It took a while for White Star to get their numbers of passengers back up, but they did. The impact, of course, was suddenly everybody was putting all kinds of extra lifeboats on board. They paid more attention to staying clear of ice, and we created the International Ice Patrol. First, it was a Navy cruiser. That summer, they had a Navy cruiser that sat out there watching the bergs and sending out messages. Then more recently, it became the Revenue Cutter Service, or the Coast Guard, that with their ocean station vessels doing. Now, today, it's done with aircraft and satellites.
Well, how far south was she, or how far south was she?
Of
I'm just trying to figure out how far south that bird came. I don't remember.
Well, it got down to a latitude of 42 and probably went a bit further south before it melted. It was at where they were. Normally the Gulf Stream goes just north of east. But the Labrador Current was coming down and they were mixing. It was a strange year that way. There was a lot of ice. Recently, the Weather Channel's been running when weather affected history, and one of them they do is on the Titanic. They try to look at the weather reports they saw, and they say, okay, a cold front came through. And they try to tie that into an optical illusion, a mirage, which may have let them see these rockets further away than they actually were, or made something that was closer appear further away. They also talk about in January when the sun and the moon were in alignment, and at the closest point they ever get to the Earth, the extra high spring tides floated icebergs clear and that of the shallows up there in Labrador and Newfoundland. That's why there were so many extra icebergs there. I'm not certain, and they're never going to be able to prove it. Yes?
Is there still salvageable material there?
There's still material there. RMS Titanic, Inc. is the salver in possession. But they have caught so much flack for the salvage they have done that they've stopped salvaging stuff. They're now looking more at scientific exploration, the sort of thing Ballard was talking about doing. But the collection of things they have that are in exhibits that have been traveling around, they have now gotten court approval to sell it. But they must sell it as one lot. I think it's over $8 million they want for this stuff. They got to sell it as one lot, and whoever buys it can only exhibit it. They can't sell off pieces here and there. I was at an auction at the South Street Seaport Museum a number of years ago, and from the first class dining room, a demi-tasse cup and saucer, $20,000. Now, how that got there was steward's department people on the ship while she was in Southampton. When the evening meal was over, they'd put them in their pockets and take them home to the wife. And subsequently, if the guy was lost, the poor wife had to support the kids somehow. If she found a collector, she would sell this. That's how you've got some of that stuff legitimately in circulation. But none of the stuff that RMS Titanic has brought up can be done that way. Now, in Titanic's favor, there's only about 6 humanly habitable submersibles that can get to her. On the bad side is there's a lot of roves that can get down there with arms and pick up and use the camera on the rove to see what you're at. But NOAA is watching her. People don't realize it, but NOAA's satellite up there is watching that spot. You stop there for more than 24 hours, you're going to have a visitor. Find out what you're doing. Yes?
You said the maneuver they used to try to avoid it went to starboard?
The order was hard to starboard, which would be the same as pushing the tiller on a sailboat to starboard. Makes the rudder go to port, brings the bow to port.
And what stopped the line of the cut from going all the way across? You said it would have slid into the iceberg.
Well, she hit it with the starboard bow, and she kind of bumped against it here and there. They kind of banged like this. And where a frame was, it was strong enough, it didn't rip it open particularly, but between frames, the berg pushing against it, remember the joints had to be overlapped and pinned through, and the berg pushing against it could either push the inside one in, the rivet would fail in tension, or as it pushed them both in, then they'd slide by and the rivet would fail in shear, but either way you wound up with a gap. Okay? Yeah.
In that period of time, sights weren't that accurate. I mean, they're not pinpoint accuracy.
I have at home a World War I vintage Navy Mark I sextant, which would have been the same as what Lytle was using, and it's a wonder they ever made it anywhere.
And also, that sight would have been taken at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon then.
Well, he took it at 7:30, but it wasn't until about 10 o'clock that Boxall finished working it out and plotting. They worked him out the Mark St. Hilaire method.
Mark Sailor?
Yeah. Any other questions? If not, I'll turn it to you. Oh, wait a minute. Yes.
In the introduction, we learned you were a captain with an unlimited license.
Yes.
Could you give us a little background on your sailing?
I sailed for American Export Lines for 8 years, and I got to be chief mate, and then I went back to the academy and taught there for 36 years. And it was while I was there that people started calling me captain. But yes, I have the license. Actually, it's in retirement now. I'm retired, and my license, I hold it for continuity purposes. I can't sail on it anymore. My hearing's not up to that game.
Well, I thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.